Where are the big stars buried? You'll be amazed when we tell you. We'll peek inside Hollywood's mansions of the dead, but also visit a cabbage patch where crooks hid the corpse of Charlie Chaplin.
If you saw this in a film, you'd say, oh, that's funny, but it could never happen.
How come this jungle clearing is the hiding place for the remains of another movie hero?
He's a legend, and he's an international legend.
And what was the heartbreaking true story they didn't reveal in the movie Titanic?
These are real individuals that were lost with real dreams.
In Hollywood's Dream Factory, do legends ever die? Real fame, the 24-karat solid gold kind, doesn't die. Our love affair with some showbiz idols goes on long after they're dead. We just can't let go. But if fans feel grief at their passing, what of the people who shared their lives? Wives, husbands, lovers. They'll fight to the death and even beyond.
Dreaded adversary on the field of battle, but a pawn in the arms of this woman.
The body of Richard Burton, movie star, became a pawn in the game for the women who loved him.
Richard Burton as Mark Antony.
He was half of one of the most famous movie love matches of all time, on and off the screen.
Or look upon, or be, or have is here now with you.
Remember, I want you to forget me, please.
Forget? How? I can never be more far away from you than this.
They were it. They were the hottest thing in the world. Richard and Liz were the Brad Pitt and Jennifer Aniston of the 60s, really. But there was nothing they could do when they weren't followed by packs of photographers.
Twice married and twice divorced, this was a love-hate relationship played out in the glare of publicity.
Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton had certain chemistry that was probably the most dangerous kind of chemistry. And they both drank like fish. So it was often just disastrous when they got together.
But maybe there was another side to this couple, only ever revealed to their closest family.
Even after their second divorce, she and Rich had an understanding that was beyond understanding.
A world away from Hollywood, Richard Burton grew up in a small village in Wales called Pontrhydyfen. And that's where the matinee idol and his screen goddess would secretly return time and time again to escape the crazy world of Tinseltown.
Can you conjure the picture of Elizabeth staying in Fourpenny Street, Pontrhydyfen? This big film star, surrounded by sycophants from all corners of the world, more yes men than you've ever seen in your life. And yet, when she was with us, she was Miss Ordinary.
We made a deal years ago, Elizabeth and myself, that we would never work apart from each other. I think that's the most important thing.
The most famous couple in the world also made a private pact. This simple village cemetery was to be their last resting place.
She wanted to be buried in Pontrhydyfen. And Rich had taken proceedings to have a double grave arranged there. But before that happened, the second divorce came along.
After that, in 1983, another marriage to a woman more than 20 years his junior Sally Hay.
I imagine that he saw in Sally safety, security, and calm, because he was also, 57 years old at that point. So he just wanted to relax, and you couldn't relax around Elizabeth Taylor.
So where would they go to carve out a new life together? Switzerland. Richard and the new Mrs. Burton settled in the village of Celigny, overlooking Lake Geneva. But if Richard Burton had found relaxation at last, how happy was his new wife?
She'd had to live with Liz's reputation the whole time. She couldn't be Mrs. Burton, even though she was Mrs. Burton, because Liz was always hooked up with Burton. In the papers, always Liz and Dick, not Dick and Sally, because it just didn't work.
They were married for just a year. In 1984, the actor died from a brain hemorrhage. Now Richard Burton's corpse became the prize in this extraordinary battle of wills between a furious ex-wife and a determined young widow. Who would decide where he was buried? Would it be in Switzerland or in Wales? A bold opening gambit, Sally Burton insisted on Switzerland. Gravediggers were hired and ordered to prepare the site in Celigny. The fighting wasn't finished. Who'd be allowed to attend the funeral?
She barred Elizabeth Taylor from going to the funeral because she said, "No, this is my time."
We were also told that we weren't expected to be at the funeral. Can you imagine that with a Welsh family? A very close Welsh family. That could not be.
His brother made his own decision. The family went anyway. But one person was missing from the graveside. Richard Burton's tempestuous soulmate wasn't there to say farewell.
Oddly, though, Elizabeth Taylor's the one that got the most condolences on Richard Burton's death, not his widow.
The game was all over when Elizabeth Taylor did attempt a secret visit a short time later. Word got out. So many newsmen crowded the cemetery that she turned around. It's quiet there now. But will Richard Burton continue to rest in peace? Perhaps not. The star left money to his closest family, which may be put to an extraordinary use, to exhume the body and bring Richard home.
We all had our cut from Richie's will. We said, why don't we have a little fund? We'll all contribute from our legacy. And perhaps one day, Sally might relent. Then he could go into my parents' grave. Have I given up hope? No. But time is running out on me.
A love that burned for 20 years couldn't be snuffed out overnight. It seems that love beyond the grave can be every bit as passionate as it was in life. Are our stars simply bigger, bolder, brasher in everything they do? If they live differently, should we wonder that they die differently? The record shows they do. But when a rock and roll Romeo finally met his Juliet, when they fell hopelessly in love, did it really have to end this way?
Nance was led face under the sink with a hunting knife still in her. In black bra and panties, dead, bled to death. One single stab wound to the abdomen.
British punk rocker Sid Vicious, his American girlfriend Nancy Spungen, they pretty well wrote the book on how to live fast, die young. But how do legends grow? was a kid like millions of others the world over. John Simon Ritchie, growing up in the London of the 1970s. A schoolyard rebel from a poor family, yes, but someone about to take on the world? The person destined to share his life was growing up in another world.
Nancy Laura Spungen, American middle-class Philadelphia, Jewish, father's a lawyer, mother's a school teacher, type of family you dream of.
But growing up too fast.
Suddenly you've got this wild child, disappears at 14, moves to New York, hangs around with every band there is in the world, becomes a heroin addict, becomes a prostitute.
Nancy Spungen hit the New York club scene at about the same time that punk rock hit London. And who was one of the biggest hitters? An ex-schoolboy, renamed, reborn, playing bad bass in a band called the Sex Pistols, Sid Vicious.
He had no guitar lessons whatsoever, couldn't play the bass, certainly played most of the Pistols gigs with his amp switched off. He was there purely for image.
Who cared how it sounded? In punk rock, there were no rules. The Sex Pistols took to the road. Sid was the prince of punk, about to fall for a punk princess.
They were hopelessly in love, but I'm not particularly sure they knew what love was.
Did they know how to live with stardom?
The biggest problem in Sid's life was that once he'd been given this name, Sid Vicious, he had to live up to it. He was a young London kid trying to live up to a nickname his mates had given him. Sid had been using drugs for 18 months before he met Nancy, but she turned the pill-popping speedhead into a heroin addict, got him completely hooked to her drug of choice. They got to the stage where they both had a 180 gram a day habit, which roughly translated means you're in too deep.
As fast as they'd arrived, the Sex Pistols were yesterday's news. Sid's record sales were falling, but his habit kept growing. It all ended here in New York.
There'd been a party that night at the hotel room. The following morning, Nancy's dead under the sink. There's loads of different rumours. Did Sid kill her? Was it a suicide pact? Nancy had always told people she'd never turned 21.
While Nancy's body was returned to Philadelphia for a family burial, Sid Vicious was booked for murder. But he'd never go to trial. A short time later, he injected a final, massive dose of heroin.
There was a note in his jeans that basically said it was a suicide pact at the Chelsea. Bury me in my motorcycle boots, leather and jeans, and bury me next to my baby, goodbye. He was 21 years of age.
Had the curtain fallen on the tragic lovers, or could there be one final act? There could, but a finale now much closer to comedy. Sid's mother was determined that the two lovers would lie together forever. Even though she'd been refused permission by the Spungen family, she brought Sid's ashes to the cemetery where Nancy lay.
She went over the fence, all the way around the back of the cemetery, went to the grave, scattered the ashes on it, came back crying and said, well, at last they're together. These are people who spent their life breaking rules. Why not have that one great rule broken at the end of it and now they're together? That seems fitting to me. That works for me.
They died pretty well as they'd lived. They left behind some heartbreak, some happiness, some music, some images of love gone wrong for the rest of us to weave a legend around. There's one music legend whose image hasn't dimmed in 30 years, who inspires fans to the most amazing feats of devotion.
People come just like they would come to be near a god or the place of a god in ancient times.
Jim Morrison, lead singer with The Doors. His spellbinding music and sultry good looks held a generation in thrall. He considered himself less a rock icon, more a serious artist, and in 1971 made his own pilgrimage to Paris. He'd never return to the United States.
He'd been gone for like a month and a half to 2 months, and he was dying to play again. And then within 6 weeks, July 3rd, 1971, he was gone. And we don't know to this day, actually, what really happened to him.
Was it a drug overdose? The mystery fueled the Morrison myth. His hold on the fans still goes way beyond reason. Texas-born photographer Michelle Campbell moved to Paris to be closer to Jim.
He had this incredible charisma and incredible intelligence. I mean, he wrote beautiful poetry, beautiful songs.
Her route, following the footsteps of Jim Morrison, is one that millions of others have taken.
Morrison had the habit of walking around, stopping in places like the Place Vosges or the Ile Saint-Louis to read and to write poetry. And that's what he came to Paris for, was to be inspired. He died over there in that building at number 17, the one with the balcony. His was the third floor apartment with the red flowers, and he lived there with his girlfriend Pamela. He was found dead in his bathtub. One morning she got up and went in. The door was locked, she couldn't get in. There was blood trickling down from one nostril, and there was no autopsy done. There was no visible signs of violence, so there can be all sorts of theories about why he died, accidental or on purpose.
Did Jim Morrison come to Paris to die? The cemetery where he lies, Père Lachaise, is where many great artists asked to be buried. Playwright Oscar Wilde, still covered in kisses. Parisian songstress Edith Piaf, fresh flowers, fresh tributes, brought here by fans every day. It's less a bunch of tombstones than a sculpture park. And now, one of the top tourist sites in Paris. But there's only one grave which is the must-see on every tourist itinerary. The grave of a 27-year-old rock musician who laid down the soundtrack for a generation, now grown middle-aged, but who know the songs by heart. It's when she realized that thousands of others shared her passion that Michelle Campbell decided to put it on record. Over the years, she's taken more than 10,000 photographs of Jim Morrison's grave. She's there right through the seasons, always a camera in hand.
I saw these amazing things, people leaving things, people coming to pay homage, sitting around, listening to music, drinking wine. It's an incredible scene. And you had all these kids coming from all over the world. They try to leave a piece, a trace of themselves. It was really something special.
The inscription says in Greek that Jim followed a divine spirit. He inspires something like religious devotion. When police tried to control young fans in 1994, a riot broke out in the graveyard. That's why, though he pulls in the tourists, the French would like Jim out of there.
The whole cemetery has been stripped bare because people want a souvenir. There's always the rumor that he's going to be dug up and moved back to America. And the cemetery would love that because that would mean that all the degradation would stop. But the family prefers to leave him in Paris, and they're the only ones that can move him legally. So he'll stay as long as they want him to stay.
And those thousands of pictures? Already they've been exhibited. They'll remain as a testimony to those who've kept the faith.
It's not a homage to Jim Morrison, but more the people that revere him. It's my homage to them as Doors fans.
Fans will travel thousands of miles to pay homage at a star's gravesite. But do they really need to? What if there was a virtual cemetery somewhere in cyberspace? Now that sounds like a great idea.
I've always been interested in graves, usually famous graves. In every city I go to, I tend to kind of check out the local cemetery. And the whole thing just snowballed to where it is now.
Salt Lake City, nerve center of a worldwide network listing every dead star you ever heard of. A vast undertaking, further testimony to the power those celebrities wield over some of us. Jim Tipton made it his mission to build the database. Mission Control is in his den. His website, findagrave.com, tells where 20,000 stars are buried and how to find their graves. He has his own reference sources, but also a worldwide network of informants.
If someone dies in London, I know, I'll call so-and-so, and if someone dies in Seattle, I'll call so-and-so. So I feel like I kind of have, feelers out all around the world. People also race to be the first person to get the Find a Grave picture on. So when a big celebrity dies, like Frank Sinatra or something, a lot of people will be out there the next day hoping that their, picture makes it to me first. I'm not doing it in a disrespectful sort of way. It's not about a morbid fascination. It's just my way of remembering people.
Hollywood can create legends. It can keep old ones alive. Some stories touch us so profoundly that movie makers go back there for inspiration time after time. This movie legend was never made from flesh and blood at all, but from steel and iron. She died all the same. And this is her grave. Hundreds died with her. Some without even a name.
These people were halfway between two worlds, so they had left the world they knew, and they're going to a new world that they didn't know, but in hopes of living the American dream.
Could it be possible, after almost a century, to put a name to these lost souls? They said she was unsinkable. Those who put their trust in this engineering wonder included millionaires, looking forward to unparalleled luxury. Poor immigrants prepared to suffer the sparse comforts of third-class steerage, dreaming only of a new life in the new world. But tragedy lay ahead, for rich and poor alike. The disaster that befell Titanic on her maiden voyage has made her a film star many times over.
What the hell are we waiting for? Those people are drowning.
What did you see?
Iceberg, dead ahead, sir.
Thanks to Hollywood, we feel we know the anguish of that night. The terror of the hundreds who drowned or simply froze to death in the dark and icy ocean. But there are secrets yet to be revealed. The key to unlocking those secrets lies here. Of the 1,600 passengers who died, 128 were never identified. They lie in graves marked simply with a number here in Fairview Cemetery in Halifax, Nova Scotia. This is the harbor where the rescue boats returned, where relatives waited, praying for a miracle, and where the dead were piled. But how could they be buried without even a name?
The expense of coming to Halifax, whether it was from Europe or whether it was from New York or perhaps even the Midwest United States, to identify a relative would have been quite prohibitive at the time. But identification of individuals was made much easier if you had more things or more possessions on your body. In particular, for example, if you had watches, that kind of thing, or paper that identified you. And obviously, people in first class and perhaps even second class probably had more of an opportunity to have those kinds of things with them. So if there was very little information that the body provided in terms of name and that kind of thing associated with it, then it would be very, very difficult then to identify the body, with the possible exception that a relative come in and looked in the morgue and said, this is a relative of mine.
One victim of the disaster touched the hearts of everyone. The rescue ship Mackie Bennett recovered the body of a little blonde-haired boy.
Someone who was 2 years old to have been lost in something like this certainly pulled at the heartstrings of not only the hardened crew, if you will, of the Mackie Bennett, but also certainly of the citizens of Halifax. The captain requested that the crew be allowed to lay the boy to rest in the cemetery. And moreover, they also banded together and purchased a grave marker for the grave as well.
Even the poorest child brought something with him. Something which has survived to the present day. His DNA. Through science and detective work, a team set out to name the unknown child of the Titanic. The clues lay close by.
Alma Paulson was a 29-year-old Swedish woman who was traveling to New York with her 4 children. Her husband had gone to the United States a year earlier to find a job, in fact was a resident in Chicago.
Her youngest child, a little fair-haired boy, 2 years old.
When Titanic hit the iceberg, she managed to get herself and her children up on deck. And the reminiscence of some of the other passengers who survived is that she sat on deck playing a harmonica to calm her children. Her body was found a few days after. It was identified based on the harmonica and a few other personal pieces of information associated with it.
None of her children was ever identified among the bodies recovered. She was buried alone. For a DNA scientist, this would prove a fascinating challenge.
There's actually a name written in a simple 4-letter code of the genetic alphabet, and so we compare the name to a maternal relative, and those 2 names should match up.
Bones were exhumed from the grave of the unknown child. DNA, carefully extracted from those remains, was compared with DNA from blood samples taken from one of Alma Paulsson's relatives still living in Sweden. The data was analyzed. Scientists hoped the lines on this chart would help resolve one of the greatest mysteries of the Titanic disaster. But could it reunite a mother and child after almost 100 years? The Titanic would not surrender her secrets quite so easily. Because the DNA from the child's grave had been so damaged over time, the first tests were inconclusive. A question mark remains.
Their relatives, so to speak, were left standing at the pier, waiting for these people to arrive, and of course, they never came. The unknown child deserves to be named. He deserves to be known. A real person with real dreams.
Perhaps before long, a new headstone will appear here. This time, one with a name. The tourists who flock here have all seen the movies. This is their way of getting closer to the Titanic legend. Just occasionally, fascination, devotion to these movie legends can go a little too far. That's when grave robbers move in. November the 11th, 1880, Melbourne, Australia. Ned Kelly, the outlaw they call Australia's Jesse James, was about to take his last short walk. To the authorities, he was just a horse thief who'd shot dead 3 policemen sent to arrest him. But for many Australians, Ned was no bandit, but a freedom fighter, battling for the poor against the British colonial government. But someone who'd lived outside the law for so long knew that it was all over. Ned Kelly fought the law, but the law won, and a legend was born.
The first feature film ever made was made about Ned Kelly.
The life of the outlaw has fascinated movie makers for almost 100 years. Before Jesse James or Robin Hood ever made their celluloid debut, he was a movie legend. He fashioned armor to ward off police bullets. In the end, it couldn't save him. He was arrested and put on trial for killing 3 policemen.
Mick Jagger as Ned Kelly.
If you kill 1, you're a murderer. If you kill 100, you're a hero.
Since that very first movie, even stars like Rolling Stone Mick Jagger have stepped forward to play the role of the ironclad outlaw.
I killed the police in a fair stand-up fight. Though if I'd have been defenseless, they would have shot me down like a dog.
After he was executed, Ned's transformation from criminal to hero was so complete that his armor and weapons are now preserved as national treasures. Melbourne Jail, where he was hung, is a museum devoted to his memory. This is Ned's shrine. So why is there no body?
After he was executed, they cut off his head. They shaved his beard and his hair. They made a death mask. The corpse was put in a very rough wooden coffin and thrown into a pit of quicklime. And that was it.
Half a century passed by. Though the images were fading, Ned's legendary status was undiminished. The freedom fighter was about to break free from his grave. In 1929, Ned's grave was accidentally broken open during building work. The outlaw's bones disappeared, grabbed by eager souvenir hunters. But who came away with Ned's skull? Is the almost sacred relic still somewhere here in Melbourne? Or was it spirited away for safekeeping? It's a question that modern-day Australians would dearly love the answer to. There are many theories and many claimants for ownership of Ned's skull. The most recent contender, farmer Tom Baxter, says he has it in a secret hiding place deep in the Australian outback. He won't reveal how it came into his possession and won't surrender it till Ned's promised a full pardon.
I'm a very patient sort of guy, and if it takes another 10 or 20 years to achieve a simple burial for Ned Kelly, then I'm prepared to wait that long.
The museums say before that happens, they need to be sure it's not a fake.
I would do a DNA test to prove once and for all it was Ned's skull, and then I would request that it be buried with his family in consecrated ground.
It's a standoff. The grave of Australia's greatest hero is still as empty as the cell which used to hold him. For the time being, the skull which may be his will stay hidden in the outback. But with or without the relic, Ned's fame endures.
Ned Kelly is a legend. He's part of our history. He was probably the quintessential Australian.
If Ned Kelly were alive today, they'd have to kill him all over again.
Why do we pursue our heroes beyond the grave? Sometimes through pure devotion, sometimes for a much simpler motive: money. They may not be packing the movie theaters anymore, but some Hollywood icons are truly printed on the memory forever.
Charlie Chaplin was the first international movie star, and by far the most famed comedic star, probably of all time.
Charlie could crack up an audience with a wink of the eye or a twirl of his cane. But this master comic didn't just leave them laughing. He saved his best comic routine until after he died. Switzerland's a favorite spot with the stars. It's there, in the village of Corsier, that Charlie made his home. When he died on Christmas Day, 1977, aged 88, he was buried in the small village cemetery. His widow, Una Chaplin, led the mourners as the world bid farewell to the movie's greatest clown. Little did they suspect that though Charlie might be dead and gone, his comic masterpiece was just about to begin.
If you saw the Charlie Chaplin silent film, you'd probably laugh at it and say, oh, that's funny, but it could never happen.
If the tale of what happened to Charlie after he died had been a movie, why, it might have looked a little like this. It was a time for tears, a time for grief. Charlie was one of those characters who just couldn't be replaced. But in a time of sorrow, there was maybe one comfort.
He made a lot of money, and it wasn't a secret that he was a rich person at the time he died. The cemetery superintendent noticed one day that the grave had been opened and the coffin was missing. Clear case of grave robbing. They drove it about 20 miles away and buried it in the field of a local farmer who had nothing to do with it and didn't actually know that the body was buried there. It must have been a part of his farm he didn't go to very often, or he might have noticed.
They knew Charlie was missing, but who'd taken him?
Maybe it was just some overzealous fans who wanted the ultimate souvenir of their cinema hero, take the body. But they started getting phone calls within a day or two from people demanding ransom. Chaplin's widow said, "We don't care. He's dead. He's dead. And besides, when he was alive, he said, if I'm ever kidnapped, never pay ransom." But the police said, well, yes, but please play along with us because we want to catch these scoundrels.
The cops knew it was only by tracing those phone calls that they'd be able to nab the villains. They were getting no closer to the world's most wanted corpse. Then, they hit upon a very simple plan to catch those crooks.
When the police knew they had them, they simply staked out every call box in the vicinity, 200 of them, told the thieves to call back for the final negotiation at a certain time, arrested everybody in Lausanne who was on the phone at a phone box at that time, weeded out the guilty from the innocent, and caught the two culprits. One of them was Polish and one of them was Bulgarian. They were aspiring auto mechanics who aspired to use the money they were going to get to open their own garage. The two culprits went to jail for various lengths of time for interfering with the dead and for attempted extortion. Charlie went back to his family and was buried back in the same cemetery nearest to where he lived. He actually had a very small family funeral.
They buried Charlie Chaplin in a concrete vault the second time around, kidnapper-proof. His widow, Una, later joined him there in Corsier Village Cemetery. But this larger-than-life, larger-than-death movie legend really has two grave markers. Alongside this vegetable plot, in the exact spot where the crooks hid the body, there's a simple wooden cross, placed there by the farmer who owns the field, to commemorate the time when a star shared his cabbage patch. There are those who, though they live their whole lives before the public, insist on a little privacy once they're gone. They come to what they call the Beverly Hills of cemeteries, last home to a galaxy of stars.
At Forest Lawn Glendale, there is Humphrey Bogart, Walt Disney, W.C. Fields, Clark Gable, George Burns and Gracie Allen, Jimmy Stewart.
They're as safe from prying eyes here as they were in those gated mansions of Beverly Hills.
The public cannot come in and view the interment location of a celebrity, not because we choose to keep them out, but because we have promised the families that we'll do so. So only family members are allowed to come in to see the private locations.
Thousands of lesser-known names lie in the public section of Forest Lawn. Ordinary people, many of them fans probably, of their famous neighbors. Consider what's happened to disturb the peace of so many celebrity grave sites, and perhaps these are the lucky ones after all. Is fame really worth the price tag? Once we're dead and gone, isn't it better just to stay that way? What if, like those Hollywood legends, we all lived forever on a flickering screen? In the showbiz capital of the world, at a cemetery called Hollywood Forever, that's what folks are trying to do. Is this the world's hippest cemetery?
The cemetery, in many ways, reflects the character of its owner.
Tyler Cassidy comes from a family of morticians. When he bought this cemetery, it was run down, dilapidated. Even the graves of great silver screen legends were overgrown, neglected. But they've been lovingly restored. This used to be the favored last resting place for Hollywood's A-list. Can it be that way again?
Sure. We hope for 1 or 2, 3, 4 semi-famous or famous people here a year. And we get some. This was a beautiful funeral here for Douglas Fairbanks Jr. last year.
The family of Beatle George Harrison chose this as the place for his cremation, though his ashes were taken to one of India's sacred rivers. But after all, famous, unknown, we all have to die sometime. But what they say here, in an amazing fashion, is why not become your own screen legend?
In the making right now is another book, soon to be released.
A tombstone that talks? As well as being buried here, customers can leave their own video epitaph, key moments in their lives, messages for the future.
My children, I love all of you, but always keep God in your life.
It's Hollywood after all. The cemetery employs video editors like other places employ embalmers. Here's where the movie epitaphs are put together. And they go one step further. They're loaded onto a website for anyone to view.
I've treated everyone in the world as though they are celebrities. Everyone should have their memories preserved in such a powerful media. You know, this cemetery receives maybe anywhere from 100 to 1,000 visitors a week, whereas our website has anywhere from 60,000 to 150,000 hits a week. That's the cemetery too. People go there to remember the people interred here. It's all about memory, facilitating memory, preserving memory.
Maybe this will be the 21st century way to go. Maybe we'll all be like the movie stars one day, with a legend that lives on long after we're gone. In quiet places all around the world, there are names carved in stone that once appeared in lights, recalling faces that the world will never forget. Their fame ensured that when they died, the story still had a way to go. Not always a happy story for those they left behind, but then that was the price of fame for legends like these.